politics and society. We're also looking for her talk. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Risjord, who has been at the center for now a few months. He came early last semester, and it was really actually quite nice to have him this fall, and he's a visiting fellow here this semester at the center. Mark is a philosopher of science, but working a lot and mostly on social sciences as well as the biomedical sciences. He has published several books. I will just mention, well, 4 books actually. I mentioned a few of them. The last one is Philosophy of Social Science, Contemporary Introduction with Routledge in 22. And in 2010, Mark published Nursing Knowledge, Science, Practice, and Philosophy, which I assume is about nursing, the nursing practices.
Nursing science.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mark is one of the few philosophers who are working actively on that topic, and we saw Daniel Winken earlier this semester.
One of the two.
Exactly. Mark has published extensively in all the best journals, so I won't go through quite a long CV. But I will mention just a few recent papers, some of which have been co-authored with Karim. So we've been working on fleet concepts and impartiality, which is forthcoming still, I assume, in philosophy of science.
Yeah, I think it's the summer somewhere.
As well as working on inferentialist understanding of modeling in of scientific modeling, also with Karim and other people. 2 of the many papers he's published recently. Today, Mark will be talking about due diligence and epistemic caution, an impartial account of inductive risk. Mark closes.
All right, thank you very much. There's a handout if you didn't get it. Thank you, Edward. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've wanted to be a fellow at the center for my entire career, but the timing never worked out. So here I am with a long CV. I'm working on a book on value freedom, and when I tell people that I'm writing a book-length defense of the value-free ideal, they kind of look at me with these sad eyes, and it's like, well, okay, go for it, dude. Right? I'm at the end of my career, I can crash and burn in a spectacular way. It'd be great. But here's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to give you a little sketch of the overall project, the voyage we're taking here, and come on. Of course, it doesn't work.
No. By now, I know.
But this was working a second ago.
No.
Man, you do all your homework beginning, and I had this working, and then of course it doesn't.
What should we draw this in? You have been clicking everything, but except the right one, I'm sure.
Yes, right. There's a finite number of buttons to press. There we go. There we go. That was the thought that accompanied the first joke. So yes, people look at me like, yeah, okay, if you want to do that value freedom thing, go ahead. But I think there's something interesting here. Actually, I was working with Karim, who convinced me to go down this path. I was a big value-laden person, contributed to the literature in that direction pretty much for a while. But then, hanging around with Karim for a long time. I don't know. So this is where we're going. The larger project. The literature on the value-free ideal, especially I think in the last decade or two, has taken the value-free ideal to be a big comprehensive thing, that you're going to build this wall around the internal part of science, and values can't touch the middle at all, right? I don't think that's a feasible value-free ideal. I honestly don't think it's an especially interesting project to try and defend that, but there are lots of interesting ways in which values do come into science, and I agree that unless values did function in science in a whole bunch of ways, science couldn't be responsive to the social concerns that it is. So what I'm interested in is what I'm calling a focused defense of the value-free ideal, or a focused value-free ideal to defend, which kind of tries to have the best of both worlds, recognize that science is permeated with values, but at the same time, there are some domains where we should, as a norm of science, keep values out. Right? The version I'm going to focus on in this book is impartiality. That is the idea that values should not play a role in the justification or the epistemic warrant for scientific claims. The context of the work that I'm doing, it treats science as a web of questions and answers. Scientific inquiry proceeds by asking questions and trying to answer them, not only at the biggest level, the most general level of scientific inquiry, but right down into the details. I think when you think about inquiry, it's an interlaced set of questions and answers. That lets me do something in this book that I think is pretty important, and that is, if you're going to defend a value-free ideal, even a focused one, I think you owe an account of how value critique can make a difference to science, either positively or negatively. That is, we sometimes critique science, and that turns it into science we want to reject, and sometimes the values are actually playing a positive role. I think that happens, but here's the reason people who wanted to reject the value-free ideal is that it seems like once I've isolated some part of science or some aspect of science and say no values here, it looks like value critique doesn't touch that anymore. So what's the story about how a value to critique can make an epistemic difference to science? Here's where I think questions make the difference. Questions have both evaluative motivations. We ask questions for evaluative reasons because of political or moral or practical issues. They also have empirical presuppositions, right? Factual statements that have to be true if the question is going to be answerable. So I think that questions, since they do permeate inquiry, are an avenue for evaluative critique to shape scientific inquiry. But note, you can reject a question because you think it's irrelevant, politically motivated in ways that I don't want to be politically motivated, but that does not give me a reason to reject the answer. Right? The answer is going to be supported or not supported, depending on what the evidence looks like. The fact that I don't like the question that it's an answer to doesn't affect that. So questions actually screen off the answers if they're epistemically well supported, but they give a venue for or an avenue through which the critique can affect the epistemic status of the science. You'll see a little bit of that in the structure of what I'm doing today, but each of my sort of approaches to the various value-ladenness arguments are going to try and preserve the insight that values are actually doing something here, but they're actually doing something that's consistent with impartiality. That's the overall structure of the book. So let's take a little tour in the neighborhood. That's a generational joke I won't explain. So here's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to talk about the argument for inductive risk, which is obviously the big threat to impartiality. It looks like that's the argument or the set of arguments that are going to make impartiality impossible if anything does. I'm going to argue that they all presuppose a particular picture of inductive inference that I'm going to call the threshold picture. And so about half of the talk will be sort of defending that claim. Then I'm going to argue that the threshold picture is actually a pretty poor interpretation of scientific practice. The threshold picture is a view of induction. It's not the only view of induction, and lots of other views of induction don't have its implications for value-ladenness. So there's at least an undischarged burden of proof here on behalf of the argument for inductive risk but let's look. Is this a good view of induction? I'm going to argue no. It doesn't do a very good job of representing scientific practice. In particular, it does a poor job in those areas where the scientific practice is adjacent to questions of policy or is politically fraught. It doesn't actually tell us very much at all. There's one button or another. I'm going to very briefly articulate an alternative view of inductive inference. Nothing will hang on this particular view. I like it, but there are others. I just put this on the table as an instance of a way of thinking about induction that is consistent with impartiality. And in the end, it does a better job of actually helping us understand inductive risk and how to respond to inductive risk than the standard view. All right, first port of call. The argument for inductive risk is actually a cloud of various arguments. They're all family related. Two families within that are often called the gap argument and the error argument. I've put versions down on the handout. I'm not going to put those up on the screen just because it's too many words, and I'm not going to work through them piece by piece. The one on page 1 is the argument that goes back to Rudner's scientist qua scientist mixed value judgments piece. This representation is Levi's representation. It's the same as lots and lots of other ones, slightly cleaned up for modern ears here. Historically, the two sort of lines of attack on this argument are to either reject the first, what I'm calling the acceptance assumption. That's Jeffrey's gambit. Scientists don't actually accept hypotheses in this sense, right? That's one way of doing it. The other is to reject the equivalence assumption. And the equivalence assumption holds that that an acceptance of a hypothesis in a scientific context is importantly analogous to, has the same structure as decisions to act. So a decision to act, throughout my talk, I'm going to assume that a decision to act is represented by something like decision theory. You've got estimation of probabilities of outcomes. You've got a utility function defined over that. That's a decision to act. The equivalence assumption says that's also the structure of acceptance of scientific hypotheses. Levi rejects that. I'm actually going to ultimately, just to flag where I'm going here, argue we should reject the third point, what I'm calling the decision lemma. So what I'm going to do for the next couple of seconds here is push on the equivalence assumption in a way that ultimately puts pressure on the decision lemma, and then call into question, all right, why should we believe the decision lemma? All right, so a standard Levi kind of line on the equivalence assumption is to develop the intuition that there's decision to act is a practical matter, right? But deciding to accept is an epistemic matter, and so we should have epistemic reasons for it. That's Levi's idea. He tries to develop that. I think Sandy Mitchell's got a really nice piece that's pushing in the same direction. She uses the language of the domain of belief and the domain of action. I like that. So there's two decisions fall into one or two places here. In the domain of belief, they look like one thing. In the domain of action, they look like another. In the domain of belief, you're accepting as true, right? So that's what you're trying. That's the intention of a scientific acceptance. I'm not going to say anything more about that line of argumentation and to follow dialectic down. The thing I want to point out about it is that it preserves the decision lemma. That is, it assumes that scientific acceptance is a matter of the scientists deciding that the evidence is sufficient to accept as true, right? I think we can keep pushing this distinction harder. And the one piece I found, which I recommend to all of you, is a completely obscure piece by Robert Audi, the epistemologist and ethicist. And he points out that in acceptance as true, as in the sense that we're interested in here, what a scientist is doing is recognizing or acknowledging or picking up on the idea that the evidence justifies the conclusion. So it's not just any old acceptance. I'm not just saying, yay, I like it. I'm saying when I accept as true, I'm sensitive to something about the evidence, right? There's a justification here. And to accept as true is to accept as justified, right? The evidence supports the conclusion. So he says, actually, it's not the same as a deductive argument. What you're doing is you're picking up on a relationship between the premises and the conclusion and seeing, recognizing, becoming aware of some sort of relationship between the two of those. Now, I want to push this to think about epistemic warrant or justification as something that you recognize. It's not something you make a decision about. And if we pause over just that little piece of language there, here's a toy example. Standing in my kitchen, I look out in the garden, and I recognize that there's a robin there. I'm a pretty good birder. I recognize a robin. I say to my wife, there's a robin in the backyard. Now, she knows that I'm a pretty good recognizer of birds under sort of normal conditions here. She seems to have picked up an epistemic warrant of some kind. She seems justified in asserting, hey, we saw the first robin of spring today. Recognitions had that kind of second personal effect or consequence for other people's epistemic status. My decisions don't. If I say, honey, I'm going to go to Frick Park and watch for birds today, that's got no, she's not is not entitled or required to go to the park with me. And if she says it's too cold, I'm not going, okay. Notice if she says it's too cold, I'm not going, the decisions don't disagree. If there's a disagreement here, it's about how we're going to spend our afternoon, right? The decisions themselves don't conflict. But if she looks in the backyard and says, no, you idiot, that's not a robin, it's a cardinal, our recognitions do conflict, and there's something we could and should be working out here, right? We look more carefully at the bird, we look more carefully at the criteria, we can do something about it. So to think about recognizing warrant is a matter of saying, yes, I'm seeing something that if you recognize it differently, we have something to talk about, right? In the sense of a decision, if I decide about warrant, there's something odd about that, right? It should be, do something for yours epistemic status as well, but decisions don't. So I prefer the language of recognition here. But once you do that, notice that the whole decision lemma becomes kind of problematic. In what sense is a scientist deciding here to accept because the evidence is sufficient? Now, that's not an argument against it, right? It's just a way of putting pressure on it and saying, all right, so what makes the decision lemma such a great idea? Where does this come from? Well, it was a lot of sweat over the last couple of months. I've been working on this since I got here in October, and it's been just wonderful. I think there's at least 5 different arguments in the literature for the decision lemma. And I'm going to quickly sort of plow through them. Actually, the differences here are part of what's responsible for this argument being really a cloud of different arguments, because these different rationales for the decision lemma actually get you different versions of the gap argument from inductive risk. So the first is suggested by this formulation of Rudner's argument on the handout, that there's something about uncertainty that motivates the decision lemma. And this is the way Levy presents it. And Levy actually says, I'm not even going to talk about those first 3 premises. He lays those out and says, oh, I'm not going to talk about those. I'm just going to go straight for the equivalence. I want to talk about those and pause over that inference. It's not it's not transparent. Why should uncertainty support this specific view about induction, a scientist making this decision? Now, uncertainty, has been pointed out in the literature, is actually ambiguous here. What do we mean by uncertainty? You might mean a general uncertainty about induction as a form of inference. That is, it's fallible. We can have as much evidence as we like, and yet the conclusion is still false. That's a general feature of induction. Or it might mean that I'm uncertain about the specific hypothesis under consideration. I don't think either of those gets us the decision lemma. As a general feature of induction, it's kind of neither here nor there. So yes, it is always possible that given all the evidence we have, our conclusions are false. That doesn't tell me whether a scientist has to make a decision. That doesn't tell me I should be adopting that view of inductive inference as opposed to any of the gazillion views that are out there. In fact, it would be really surprising if it did, because fallibility of induction is a general feature of science. Any view of induction, I mean, there have been attempts to make it a form of deductive inference. Set those aside, all the rest have to be views in which there's uncertainty, but not all of those involve the decision, that not all of those look like the decision lemma. So the general uncertainty does not entail it. And specific uncertainty is not any more helpful either. If I'm in a situation where I've got a hypothesis and I have a specific doubt about it, that seems like a situation where I shouldn't be regarding it as justified. So either the decision lemma just doesn't apply yet, or it's giving me really bad advice, right? So uncertainty, I think, just does not entail the decision lemma. Underdetermination has been a more recently popular way of articulating this, sort of post Longino's work, bringing the underdetermination idea in. It actually fails to support the decision lemma for exactly the same pair of reasons. Look, underdetermination, you're either talking about global underdetermination, theories or something like that, being 2 theories being accounting for the same body of evidence, or you've got 1 body of evidence and 2 hypotheses that I'm worried about, something like a transient underdetermination situation. Global underdetermination, again, that's neither here nor there about exactly how induction works. As many people have pointed out, it's kind of a philosopher's cartoon anyway, because we're never in a situation where we have 2 theories that account for all the same evidence and somehow we have to choose between them. That just doesn't ever, it's hard enough to find, as my advisor used to say, it's hard enough to find one theory, much less two. And again, that's a logical point about the structure of theory. Any view of induction involving decisions or no is going to have to be consistent with it. And there's lots of them out there. So it doesn't, the decision lemma doesn't fall out. And again, if it's transient underdetermination, if I have two hypotheses supported by the same evidence right now, then I don't seem like I'm justified in asserting either one. The epistemic warrant anyway, we should hold off on that. So those two justifications for the decision lemma seem to me just not to go through at all. Now, another move that people make in the literature is it's very rarely explicit. Intiman's got a piece where she actually makes it very nicely explicit. But I think a lot of the literature simply just doesn't take point 3 on that argument as a lemma. It takes it as an assumption. So we're restructuring the argument a little bit. We just assume that inductive inference has this kind of character to it. And this is your gappy warrant. You can do that. I'm not going to give an argument against it. I only want to say this. It's a substantive view of induction. And it's tendentious in the sense that there are alternatives. So what this kind of move does is it turns the argument into the consequence of adopting a particular view. What the argument from inductive risk says is, if you have a view of induction that involves decisions about sufficiency of evidence, then you're going to have value-ladenness in your inductive inference. Actually, it's pretty trivial when you say it that way, but that's really what's happened here is you've assumed the gappy warrant, and you've ended up with value-laden inductive inference. Okay, fine. So gappy warrant's an argument, or it's not an argument. You can just take it as an assumption. That's fine. Just quickly, historically, there's two other justifications. Rudner's article is usually cited as part of a triumvirate of people making the same argument, Braithwaite and Churchman. They actually have very different motivations for the argument. Braithwaite's book, Scientific Explanation, he has a whole chapter on the problem of induction. So this is 1948, I think, something like that. Whole chapter on the problem of induction. Now, he takes the problem seriously. Many of his colleagues at the time were rejecting the problem of induction as a pseudo problem. Right? But he's taking it seriously. Here's a bunch of possible solutions. None of them work. So Braithwaite doesn't say this, but you can actually see inductive skepticism as a reason for adopting both the decision lemma and the equivalence lemma. Because after all, if inductive inference isn't warranted at all, right, if there's no justification for inductive inference, what are you going to do? Any decision to accept is going to have to be a practical decision. All the things I was talking about in terms of putting pressure on the equivalence lemma assumption, they just kind of dissipate if you're an inductive skeptic. So this is a way of getting both the equivalence lemma, equivalence assumption, and decision lemma, boom, boom, from inductive skepticism. Sweet. Substantive and at least a little bit tendentious, right? Churchman is a pragmatist of a kind of reductivist streak. He explicitly asserts that any belief has the structure of an action. So he's really doubling down on the equivalence assumption and then pushing back on arguments that I would make. So he's restructured the argument so that the decision lemma actually follows from the equivalence, right? So you could do that. It's possible. It's a substantive view about induction. So the gap argument can be saved, right? But only at the cost of accepting a particular view of induction, the view of induction expressed in really, it's the decision lemma and the equivalence assumption or something very like it. So that means at least there's an undischarged burden of proof. If the error is going to conflict with impartiality, you've got to show that the view of induction that you're working with is at least as good as other options and preferably better. Now, one might think that the error argument escapes all this. And again, it's great to be at the center. The second day Chris was here, we were having some great conversations. He helped me see that actually the error argument does actually fall these things. I went back and read his paper in the light of what I was thinking about, read his paper again, and saw that there's a deeper connection here than I had seen. Because it does look on the surface of it, this is on the other side of your handout, he doesn't make no explicit mention of induction or anything like that. It looks like this is coming right off of something about scientists' responsibilities, and that's the way the argument's usually kind of presented to us. But notice the conclusion. The conclusion is actually, this is Matt Brown and Jen Havestad's presentation, somewhat cleaned up and straightened out, but the same logic is there. The conclusion, non-absolute values have a legitimate role to play in the internal stages of science. That is not inconsistent with impartiality. A role could be any role, right? And so by itself, this argument doesn't really show very much. But of course, that's not the intended reading. In Matt Brown's writing about this, he actually, when he summarizes the argument, he explicitly says that values are playing a role in justification, which of course they'd have to be doing if you're going to be conflicting with impartiality. So if you read that conclusion as the legitimate role is a legitimate role somehow involving induction, then where does that come from? It comes from premise 5 there. But that encodes the decision lemma into the idea of inductive risk. And so what's happened in this argument, I argue, is that the idea of inductive risk has built in these ideas. Right? So where scientists ought to consider inductive risks and the weighing of inductive risk requires consideration of non-epistemic consequences, that's just the decision lemma all over again. Right? And it looks to me also as if the third premise, if scientists are responsible for their actions as scientists, they ought to consider predictable consequences of inductive risk. How would that be possible unless acceptance of a hypothesis had the same structure as something you might be responsible for in action? Right. So what's happened here in the error argument is this picture of induction has gotten baked into our conception of inductive risk, which I think is actually problematic, and I'm going to come back around to it really quickly. So I want to say that all versions of the argument from inductive risk actually are making an assumption about induction. I'm going to call it the threshold picture, and essentially it's just the first, third, and fourth premises of the gap argument. So how plausible is this picture? Is it a good picture? Is it a good picture of induction? Is it a good picture of induction under circumstances where the environment is politically fraught or things are problematic? Is it a good way of understanding what we're trying to respond to and responding to inductive risk? No. Questions? No. All right. The case studies that I'm working on in the book are American anthropology and sociology in the late 19th and through the 20th century, responding to the various racial problems that we faced as a country. So this is in sociology, a lot of the social problems that came out of the end of slavery and integration. And anthropology has a lot to do with the concept of race. In this chapter, I'm working with a particular study by the Housing and Urban Development Department in the late 70s. So in the mid 60s, if you remember your history, the Congress passed various bits of civil rights legislation, including making it illegal to racially discriminate in housing. HUD was charged with enforcing that and monitoring it. So one of the things that doesn't happen after the civil rights legislation is segregation doesn't change much, right? You still have very highly segregated cities, but racial discrimination has been made illegal. What's up? Well, maybe, just maybe, right? It's just gone underground. And what you have is plenty of racial discrimination, but it's just not so overt. No one's putting signs in their windows anymore, but it's happening in other ways. This is what HUD investigates. So they set up a very large study, and they use what they called an audit methodology, where they sent pairs of auditors matched on the various socio-demographic characteristics you get except for race, send them into rental offices and mortgage offices, and then they filled out a questionnaire about how they were treated. And then you're looking for differences in treatment between these two auditors. This slide says 600 matched pairs, 40 cities. It's a big study. Really interesting for this kind of thing because this is not like FDA approval is not pointing directly to action. The question is there racism in housing, rental and mortgage decisions, or somehow in the market on the decisions? And they're not recommending any particular actions that come out of this. One of the things that's interesting about this is there's extensive methodological discussion in the HUD document. It's great for philosophers for this reason. They're really going through, and this is actually interesting. So how do scientists respond to work in a politically fraught environment? One of the things the HUD scientists seem to do is a lot of careful anticipatory discussion of the methodology. So a lot of challenges here, and rather than just, in a standard social scientific paper, you kind of get, boom, here's your methodology, here's 4 or 5 ways in which we might be wrong, we're done. No, it's every particular decision has got, here's the possibilities, here's what we did. So for instance, there's a tension between what they call control and credibility, right? You'd love it if the 2 auditors behaved and spoke in exactly the same way, because there wouldn't be any possible confounds about that difference. But of course, if you're a rental agent and you get 2 guys coming in, one after the other, who read from the same script, you're not gonna know something's up. And by the way, I love this. HUD was using the very same methodology for enforcement investigations. So if they had intelligence that there might be some racial discrimination going on in a certain city or a part of a city, they were using this methodology to find the people and prosecute them. In fact, there's also really interesting from a point of view of IRB stuff now about what happens when we find racial discrimination and do we prosecute or not, right? So that was, set that aside. Also very cool about this. So they couldn't make people identical. They had to worry that people were going to be changing their behavior because of the possibility of being audited. So they had this tension to negotiate, and they put in a bunch of things in terms of their training and their selection of the auditors and this sort of stuff to try and mitigate exactly this. A lot of concerns with consistency among the sites. Randomization, they might have been optimal to randomize the order of the appearance. The one's going to have to come after the other. Does the black person go white first or the white person go first? What they decided to do was make it just systematic across the 2 areas of concern. I think it was the black auditor went in to the rental offices first and the white auditor went into the mortgage offices first. Now, one of the things that they said about that in particular and across the board on these methodological discussions, so not only were they did a lot of kind of preemptive discussion of the methodological choices, they repeatedly make conservative decisions. So every time they're making one of these decisions, they say, all right, it looks as if we go this way, we're more likely to underestimate racial discrimination than overestimate it. And okay, now you might, if you think about this from kind of the standard inductive risk argument literature, that's a little bit weird, right? Because this is the housing and urban development, their interest explicitly actually in the preamble to the report is in things like legislation, right? They want to legislate and solve these social justice issues that are arising around segregation. And so you'd think that their interest actually, they'd care less about the false positives, right? And say, well, if we overestimate a little bit, we want regulation is a good thing, right? But actually they're going the other way. So curious feature I will return to. So there's the HUD study. How does the threshold picture, what does the threshold picture tell us about, help us understand how this HUD scientists are working? Well, the idea is that a scientist makes a decision to accept on the basis of the evidence, deciding that the evidence is sufficient. You have enough. We could ask for more, we could ask for less, it's sufficient. Well, the HUD scientists are really clear on what their conclusion is. This is their principal finding. Right? The study provides definitive evidence that blacks are discriminated against, and then that's the evidential claim. And this is, I separated these as paragraphs to make it a little more readable, but this is actually one continuous quote. Right? That's the conclusion. Did they look for sufficient evidence? What would it? But here's where I'm puzzled about the threshold picture, just as a picture of induction. What would it mean to have, if you're thinking about sufficient evidence, it must be that you could think about, well, we need more evidence or less evidence. What does more and less even mean in this context? I can think of 3 things it means, and none of them make any sense. Maybe you can help me with some alternatives. The first actually shows up in the literature once in a while. They say, okay, what we mean by more evidence is increasing the acceptance level. So instead of accepting it P01, we'll accept it P001. That's certainly not what the HUD scientists do. They do report p-values. They regard O1 as strong evidence. They regard O5 as weak evidence. Anything lower than O5 they throw away, which is absolutely standard social scientific procedure. So even though they're working in what they recognize as a very fraught environment, they're not doing anything different from sociologists or anybody else working in environments that have nothing to do with politics, right? And I think also that this idea is a misunderstanding of what p-values are telling us. They're not telling us how much evidence there is. They're telling us the chances of the correlation we're finding is due to chance. That's important to know, but I think treating that as more evidence or less evidence, I think, is a confusion. But I'm gonna leave that point. Doesn't really, I don't see how this could give us more evidence in the first place. I can think of two ways in which you can actually get more evidence, right? You might replicate the study. That would be more evidence. But note, the decision lemma says, before I accept the conclusion to this study, I have to decide that the evidence is sufficient, right? Which would mean I've got it before the HUD scientists made their principal finding, they'd have to wait till somebody else replicated. They didn't do that, and nobody does that, right? Same with triangulation. I might look for a different methodology, right? That to do something that's similar. That would be more evidence, but again, I'd have to wait on that before I could draw my conclusion. Nobody does that. So I don't think that the threshold picture shows us very much about this. I'm not even sure how to apply it. So let me talk a little bit about an alternative that I think might do a little better job. And again, there are many alternatives. This is one particular one. And broadly, the alternatives kind of fall these days into two categories. You've got people who are doing, kind of following the logical probability line of thought and working formally. This goes back to Carnap and others, but now it's it's our colleagues across the valley there who are doing all kinds of cool stuff with causal inference. On the other hand, you might be more naturalistic about it, and this also goes back to the 40s. You have people in the 50s. You have people like Toulmin, early 60s, Hansen, arguing that the problem of induction is just not a problem. If you want to know the answer to this question, go look at what the scientists are doing. So it's a naturalistic kind of approach. That, I think, also has a lot of contemporary kind of adherence. And I'm going to start there. That's my kind of preferred approach. So I'll start with our friend John's material theory of induction. I think this is a nice naturalistic way of going. Again, it's one possible way, but I'm going to articulate it. So on John's view, induction is warranted by the facts of nature. It's the world that warrants our inductions, not decisions by us. So what does this mean? It means that when we've got something like a sample or a part that we're going to generalize to the whole, that projectability is underpinned by the way the world works. So there's a material fact there. Metaphorically, I like to say that the facts have edges and they have holes. So I can start with a sample and make an inference that goes too far. I can fall off the edge of that material fact, or I can fall into one of the exceptions in the middle of it. An example, it's a pretty well-known feature of human practice in psychology that if I want to change behavior, we can change behavior by giving people more information. So if we want to increase seatbelt compliance, I can predict that giving people more information will, about the consequences and so on, will increase seatbelt compliance. That's a very nice, very robust material fact against which I can make specific inductions in all kinds of places. But notice it's got a limitation to it. At a certain level of saturation, more information stops doing the work. So it's kind of an S-shaped curve. I get up to a certain level, I can advertise as much as I want, but the compliance isn't going to go up. So that's the edge of the material fact. The world just is such that the induction fails when I get up there, but it also has holes in it. Even in the sweet spot of that induction, where I've got, we're sitting around 20% compliance, and I predict that if we put this much more information out there, we're going to raise it. There's people out there it's not going to reach because, say, they're antique automobile enthusiasts. Their automobiles don't have seat belts, so they don't care, right? They're an exception to that induction. So if you're looking at that population, the information is not going to change their behavior. So there's exceptions even within the middle. So induction's uncertain, but it's guaranteed, it's warranted epistemically by the material fact. Now that's a kind of epistemic, externalist sort of warrant. That is, it's what it's the conditions under which our inferences are reliable, right? But what about the more, how do we know, right? This is a question John gets, like, so all right, so fine, there's this fact out there, but how would we tell? And the answer a naturalist wants to give is, well, just go do more science, right? Which is right. And the answer is not going to be, oh, here's a bunch of rules of scientific method that'll get you there. That's the material facts are too varied, too messy for any set of rules to work. But there is something we can do. And in a paper published in the last year or so, Kareem and Jared Millson and I proposed inquisitive due diligence as a criterion for epistemic warrant. The idea is you're warranted when you've answered all the challenges. So these are pointed, what we're calling pointed questions. So a question is relevant to a particular inference if it raises a possible defeater. Have you thought about this confound? What if your population includes these folks, right? Each of those is a potential defeater such that if the answer goes in one way, your induction is undermined. If it goes the other way, we're still safe. And once we run out of those, then what else are you going to do for your epistemic warrant, right? You're justified. It seems like, boom, we got justification. Now, it's of course fallible. Could there be some evidence that we haven't got yet because, we just didn't probe? Of course there could, right? But that's true of all epistemic warrants. Actually, it's even true of the deductive ones, but I'm not going to go into that here, right? It could be. Just look at the history of long things like Fermat's last theorem, right? Lots of people thought they had proofs, but it turns out they were wrong. So I think of inquisitive due diligence, actually note that it fits really nicely with John's view, right? Because the pointed questions would be exactly asking about the possible edges and holes with respect to a specific inductive inference. So I think of that as the internal part. You put these things together and there's an account of inductive warrant for you. Taking kind of off-the-shelf ingredients and pouring them together. It doesn't have any decisions. Right, there's no decisions about sufficiency of evidence. So it's not the kind of thing the decision lemma is pointing to. It's an alternative view of induction. And I think it does a lot better job of explaining the HUD sort of practice. You see those methodological decisions as preemptively answering pointed questions. What about this confound? Well, we've already thought of that confound. And here it is, in the methodological discussion. So of course, in a fraught environment, that's exactly what you'd want to do. You'd think about blocking those pointed questions right at the outset. Also, I think it explains why they're making the conservative choices, right? What they're doing is shoring up epistemically their position by making it less ambitious, right? So that means reducing the number of pointed questions that can be asked about it. And if you think about pointed questions, especially in a fraught environment, questions are part of a two-person dialectic. You are asking a question of me. So if I'm thinking about these questions, especially if I'm thinking about them in advance, I'm thinking about, all right, where might these questions come from? And if I'm in a politically fraught environment, I know there's going to be lots of them. So I need to think about these very carefully. And one thing I might well do is just kind of reel back my ambitions, build a stronger epistemic foundation for what I'm doing, less vulnerable to the pointed questions. So they're responding by making it epistemically stronger, but there's not any question of adding more evidence or making decisions about more evidence. So it doesn't fit the decision lemma framework at all. Okay. Now let me turn to the question of inductive risk. Historically, the following move, Churchman responds to Carnap. So Churchman's the pragmatist, and he actually is thinking about Carnap, the logician, doing all this logical stuff that doesn't involve the decisions that he thinks induction involves. And he says, look, the only way you're going to get a good account of inductive risk, he doesn't use that language, but he's clearly thinking about this phenomenon, is if you have an account of induction or inductive acceptance or something that explicitly builds the values in. It's the only way you're going to do it. And you can get similar arguments. I see Heather Douglas's 2009 book has a long chapter 3 talking about the value of free ideal. And one of the points there is we need to think about scientific inference and scientific method in terms that let science be responsible, which means responding to inductive risk. And the only way to do that is to think about, and that's not exactly your argument, but you can kind of interpret it that way. So what about inductive risk? The problem, as I've already pointed out, thinking about the error argument, is that the idea of inductive risk already bakes in this view of induction, right? So if the complaint is you're not responding to inductive risk as I've conceptualized it, then that's just question begging, right? You've conceptualized it in certain terms. Of course I haven't, because that's just a bad conception of induction. What we need, and I'm going to spend the last few minutes here sketching this out, is a neutral conception of inductive risk, one that anybody in the game with different accounts of induction can accept. So that's what I'm going to quickly develop here for you. First step, I think everybody has to agree that the problematic consequences we're talking about, these downstream inductive risks, again, notice how this language is built right into the idea of the consequences. These problematic consequences, they can arise. So the equivalence assumption says there's two things. There's acceptance of the hypothesis, and then there's actions, right? The consequences can really arise only from action, because acceptance can be done with no consequences at all. I, as a private individual, in my mind, can, even if you take the threshold picture, look at the evidence and decide that it's sufficient. And if I never say anything, if lightning strikes me, or I just keep my mouth shut, none of these potential problematic consequences can flow, right? They're only going to flow if at least I say it, teach it, publish it. And actually, honestly, look, in the cases that we actually talk about in the inductive risk literature, it's consequences of legislation or changes in practice. So there's actually, the consequences are flowing. So it's something like this picture, that we've got consequences as the direct coming out of the action, but somehow or other, and here's what the threshold picture tells us, is that these flow back up to the acceptance and should influence acceptance so that we get the decision. Okay, I think I would certainly agree with that as a person who rejects the equivalence assumption. I think if you accept it, it's still a picture, that's where you should be. Second point, a decision to act does not require scientific justification. So a decision to act as a matter of policy, as a matter of individual practice, doesn't require scientific justification, doesn't require epistemic warrant. After all, it's perfectly rational to base the probabilities in your decision on an estimate you know is wrong, right? But it's the best one I have, and so I'm going to use it to get my probabilities. I can base my probabilities on a coin flip, on a random number generator. There's nothing irrational about that. The question is, where do I get my probabilities? And presumably I get it from my best available information. Sometimes, assuming the science sometimes gets us good and gets us truth, which I'd like to do, then yeah, that's going to be a better estimate of the probabilities if I rest on scientific warrant. But I can't always. There's lots of cases where policy decisions have to be made in the absence of the science. So it's not scientific warrant per se that's actually doing the work. It's the quality of the information that I'm getting. So the picture actually should look like this, right? The warrant is not necessary and it's not sufficient, right? What I have is a body of information on which I'm basing the probabilities of my action theory. So the probabilities are my decision theory. The probabilities come in from this side. The utility function comes in from this side. I've got a decision that'll have the consequences. So what's the problem with epistemic risk? How do these things connect together? Well, I've got a couple of options. If I've got an action decision, I've got two options. And I'm going to estimate the probabilities, and I'm going to do utility weighing of those and come up with the best option. If I have bad information, it could be that given the information I have now, I make a suboptimal decision, right? If my information had been better, I would have taken the other path, ended up with a better outcome, right? So the risk is really the risk of making a bad decision. And so I think the phenomenon, independent of our thinking about induction here, is actually, I just said this, I got ahead of myself, that the bigger the difference between the decision outcomes, right? The higher the chance of a suboptimal decision, or the higher the cost, not the chance, I'm sorry, the cost of a suboptimal decision, as those get to be bigger in difference, the more important it is that my information is accurate, right? That, I think, is the phenomenon of epistemic inductive risk, but it doesn't have anything to do with induction at all. It is a case where we should be cautious. I'm a carpenter, and I think the old carpenter's adage, measure twice, cut once, it precisely expresses this, right? If I've got a very expensive board, the difference between cutting it in the right place and cutting it in the wrong place has got big consequences. It's money that is a difference. If I've got a whole lot of these cheap boards, I can be sloppy because if I make the difference between an optimal and a suboptimal decision is very, very small. I don't, in fact, maybe small enough I don't even care about it. So that's the phenomenon that we're worried about when we're worried about inductive risk. All right, so how do these different views, the threshold picture and the in due diligence or any other picture for that matter, fare? There's really two kinds of cases that we need to think about. There's cases where we need to make a decision to act and the scientific warrant, we're kind of simplifying here to one claim, hasn't been established yet. A lot of these cases in the inductive risk literature, in fact, it's a lot of the cases people are concerned about are precisely where we have to act before all the evidence is in. Or maybe we have like the HUD study, right? The HUD study ended, they came down with a very strong conclusion, and now maybe this is case 2, we're in Congress saying, okay, what legislation do we do now, right? We've got the warrant established. How does the threshold picture fare with these two? In the first case, the threshold picture either has nothing to say or it gives us epistemically, I think practically bad advice as well. So by hypothesis, we haven't finished the study, right? The evidence is not in, so it's not a case where we're ready yet to make a decision about the sufficiency of the evidence, right? So the threshold picture is just silent on what we should do. Or you read the threshold picture as saying, no, we should accept before all the evidence is, but that just seems like bad advice. I'm saying I'm justified epistemically because I'm in a hurry. That's not good epistemology. It's not good science. So it doesn't seem to be, at the very least, it's not very helpful here. And what happens when the warrant is already established? Well, again, the threshold picture tells us nothing because warrant has been established, right? It tells us nothing about how we should respond to the situation of epistemic caution. So, unhelpful. Let's think about this a little differently. Take case 1. So we're in a situation where we have some evidence has come in, but we're not ready to say, here's we've justified this conclusion. Well, the decision that we need to think about is not the decision to act, but whether the decision to act now rather than wait. So do I act now based on the information I have, or do I act later on the basis of more information? And there's some nice technical work on this that I'm not going to tell you about, but you can actually get a measurement of the information value of a question out of the decision theoretic matrix that gives you just right there. In other words, the more likely it is the answer to this question would move the needle from this decision to that needle, from this decision to that decision, if I knew the answer to it, the more information value it has. And so now it's a calculation, is the information value of this answering this question enough to make me wait, or should I just go ahead and decide now? So here you have a case where epistemic caution is influencing scientific inquiry, right? Do we keep going, or do we say, no, we're done with the COVID testing, we're just going to give everybody the shot, right? Even though the experiments aren't in. That's going to be a matter of the consequences, but that tells us precisely nothing about whether or not that's warranted, right? It tells us whether we should act on the information we have or keep asking more questions. So again, a way that the questions are influencing the values are influencing the questions, but not influencing the epistemic warrant. Second case, suppose we're like the Congress after the HUD study comes in, actually exactly the same choice point. Yes, we have a scientifically warranted conclusion on our hands. Do we act on that? Well, again, the question really is, do we act now or do we wait for more? And John has a really nice remark in his chapter on inductive risk in the induction book, where he says the proper response to inductive risk is to explore the material fact. And I think that's this is really nice. So in the case of the HUD study, segregation, residential segregation is a complicated phenomenon with lots of causes. Interpersonal racism is at best one. That it's entirely possible that the historical structural causes are so powerful that interpersonal racism actually gets completely washed out. That's possible. So if you're thinking about how do we legislate on housing segregation, and you have this HUD study as a piece of information, the question is, do I look for other studies looking for other kinds of related phenomena, not that same inductive conclusion, but the other phenomena that might also explain segregation, be relevant to the decision I have to make. And again, do I wait and start those inquiries and wait on their results? Or do we just say we've got enough information now? It depends on the cost of waiting, right? So again, it's a case where the epistemic caution is shaping inquiry, but it's not telling us whether or not our induction values should be playing a role in our inductive inferences. So winding up, this is a way better title for the talk, but I thought of it like last Wednesday. I think you've got this, right? The argument presupposes this threshold picture. It does, I think, a poor job of representing how scientists actually go about doing these sorts of things. And it really tells us almost nothing about responding to epistemic caution. So I think what we have at best, I haven't shown you the argument is unsound, but I think it is an artifact of a particular view of induction, and a view of induction that is arguably not the best available. So yes, you could have this, but it's just an artifact. Thank you.
Take a 2-minute break, and then we'll have time for questions.